The cold was not merely a condition of the air, it was a presence. It had teeth that bit into the frozen mud of the barn floor and a voice that whispered through the cracks in the old timber walls. It was a predator, and the man who stood in the cavernous darkness of his own barn understood predators. He held the rifle in a way that suggested it was not a tool, but an extension of his will, a long steel finger pointing toward the rustling sound in the hayloft. The sound was small, frightened, but it was not a sound that belonged there. Nothing belonged in his barn but his horse, his tools, and the profound, echoing silence he had cultivated for 5 years. He had heard it from the house, a faint scraping, a muffled cough carried on the wind that was already beginning to keen with the promise of a blizzard. He had felt the intrusion like a violation of his skin, a disturbance in the perfect, desolate order of his world. Now, his boots made no sound on the dirt floor as he moved beneath the loft. The smell of hay, leather, and cold dust filled his nostrils, a familiar scent now tainted by something else. The scent of fear. "I know you're up there," he said. His voice was rust low and grating from disuse. He did not speak to people often. He did not speak to anyone at all most days. "Come down now, slowly." There was a long pause, a stillness so absolute he could hear the frantic beating of his own heart, a dull, angry drum in his chest. Then a shape began to resolve itself in the gloom at the edge of the loft. It was a woman, her form made indistinct by the shadows and the worn, dark blanket she had wrapped around herself. She was a specter, a thing of rumor and whispered prejudice he had heard in town, the Apache widow who haunted the edges of civilization, begging for scraps no one would give. Behind her, a smaller shadow clung to her legs, a child. His grip on the rifle tightened. Trespassers, vagrants. He had built this life of solitude precisely to keep the world and its desperate, messy problems at a distance. His land was his fortress. The rifle came up, the stock settling into the familiar hollow of his shoulder, the iron sight finding the center of the woman's form. It was a posture of absolute authority, a statement that needed no words. The woman did not flinch. He saw the glint of her dark eyes in the sliver of moonlight that pierced the barn's gloom. She looked down the barrel of the gun, and he saw not terror, but a weariness so profound it was almost a physical force. She held up a hand, not to beg, but to command a moment's pause. Her lips parted, and a single plume of white breath escaped into the frigid air. She spoke, her voice quiet but clear, carrying a strange, resonant dignity in the frozen silence. It was not a plea for her own life. He has seen enough men with guns. The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. They were not for her. They were for the child, the small shadow half hidden behind her. The man's focus shifted for a fraction of a second to the boy's wide, dark eyes staring out from the folds of the blanket. In those eyes he saw not the fear of a child, but the haunted, ancient stillness of one who had witnessed the unspeakable. And in that moment, the rifle in his hands became impossibly heavy. The cold in the barn was nothing compared to the ice that flooded his own veins. A memory rising from a grave he kept meticulously tended in the back of his mind. A small hand, a fevered brow, a silence in his cabin that was becoming too loud to bear. His own son had seen enough sickness, enough helplessness. This boy had seen guns. Tay, slowly, with a movement that felt like it was tearing something inside him, he lowered the rifle. The barrel dipped toward the earth. Defeated, the authority drained out of him, replaced by a hollow ache. He cleared his throat, the sound raw. "The storm will be here. By morning, it will be a bad one." He stated it as a fact, an observation of the natural world that required no emotion. "There's an empty stall. It's dry. There are horse blankets." He did not wait for an answer. He turned his back on them. A deliberate act of dismissal that was also, in its own way, an act of trust. He walked out of the barn, leaving the doors slightly ajar, and did not look back to see if they would accept his grudging, unspoken offer of sanctuary. The emptiness of his cabin waited for him, and for the first time in a long time, he felt its cold was a choice. The storm arrived as promised, a white fury that descended from a slate-gray sky. It was not a gentle snowfall, but a violent assault, the wind screaming like a vengeful spirit around the corners of the cabin. The man, the rancher, had spent the hours before its arrival in a state of restless activity, chopping extra wood, checking the seals on his windows, his movements precise and economical. He was a man who did not live in his home so much as occupy it. The cabin was brutally simple, scrubbed clean, but devoid of any softness. A table, 2 chairs, a stone hearth, a bed. It was a place of function, not comfort. The home of a man who had methodically stripped all traces of a former life from its walls. He found himself watching the barn through the window, his jaw tight. He had left them food, a heel of bread, and a piece of jerky on a crate just inside the door. A necessity, he told himself. He couldn't have them starving to death on his property. It was a practical problem, not a charitable impulse. Yet as the wind grew stronger, driving needles of snow horizontally through the air, the image of the boy's eyes returned to him. He saw the thinness of the woman's blanket, the inadequate shoes on her feet, clothes meant for a different land, a different season. The stall would be dry, but the cold would find them. He thought of the fever that had taken his own son, how the boy had shivered even when wrapped in every blanket they owned. The memory was a shard of glass in his gut. With a curse that was a raw exhalation of breath, he pulled on his heavy coat, grabbed a lantern, and stepped out into the blizzard. The journey to the barn was a battle against a physical force. The wind tore at him, trying to rip the lantern from his grasp. When he finally forced the heavy barn door open, he found them huddled in the designated stall, wrapped together in a single horse blanket. The woman looked up, her expression unreadable, her body a shield for the child. The boy was asleep, his small face pale in the lantern light. The rancher did not speak. Words felt useless, intrusive. He simply jerked his head toward the house. "Come on." The woman hesitated, her eyes searching his for a trap. He saw the flicker of pride, the deep, ingrained distrust. He understood it. He felt it himself. He turned away again, not waiting for her, and began the trek back, letting his action be the only argument. A moment later, he heard the crunch of her footsteps behind him, a small, determined sound, nearly swallowed by the storm. Inside the cabin, the warmth was a shock to the system. He gestured for them to stand by the hearth, where the fire was now roaring. The woman unwrapped the blanket from the boy. The rancher busied himself at the stove, ladling a thick beef stew into 2 bowls. He set them on the table without ceremony. "Eat." He watched them from the corner of his eye as he stoked the fire. The boy ate with the desperate hunger of a starving animal, his small hands trembling as he held the spoon. The woman ate slowly, deliberately, as if forcing herself to maintain a measure of dignity in the face of absolute need. The gulf between their states of being was a chasm in the small room. He was a man with a full larder and an empty life. They were people with nothing left but each other. The quiet sounds of their eating were the first domestic noises to fill the cabin in 5 years, and they felt both alien and achingly familiar. When they were finished, he pointed to the ladder that led to the small loft. "There are furs." It was not an invitation, but a command. He was establishing a boundary, a clear physical and emotional separation. They were a temporary problem, a necessity he had acquired because of a storm in a boy's eyes. The woman nodded, her gaze briefly meeting his. He saw gratitude there, but it was a guarded, wary thing, as sharp and dangerous as the winter itself. She took the boy's hand, and they ascended the ladder, disappearing into the shadows above. The rancher sat alone at his table for a long time, listening to the storm rage outside and the faint, soft sounds of breathing from the loft above. The silence in his cabin had been broken. It was replaced by a new kind of quiet, one that was filled with the presence of others. He did not know if it was better or worse. He only knew it was different, and the difference was unsettling. The blizzard imprisoned them for 3 days. The world outside the cabin ceased to exist, replaced by a swirling vortex of white. Inside, a strange, silent rhythm established itself. The rancher was a man of constant motion, his restlessness a palpable energy in the confined space. He mended harnesses, sharpened tools, oiled his rifle. Each task performed with a focused, methodical intensity that left no room for interaction. The woman, whose name he still did not know, was a ghost of quiet efficiency. She did not ask for tasks, she found them. On the second day she took one of his torn work shirts, and, using a small sewing kit, she produced from a hidden pocket, began to mend it with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She moved with a fluid grace, her hands never idle. She swept the hearth, tidied the small space, and spoke to her son in low, soft tones, in a language he did not understand. The boy was her shadow, a silent, observant presence who watched the rancher with an unnerving, solemn curiosity. On the 3rd morning, the wind died. The world was reborn, buried under a thick, pristine blanket of snow. The silence that followed the storm was absolute, a muffling of all sound that felt both peaceful and profound. The rancher knew the work that waited for him. The north fence line bordering the creek would be down in places, weighted by the heavy snow. It was a long, cold job. As he pulled on his coat and gathered his tools, the woman came down from the loft. She stood before him, her hands clasped. "We will help." It was not a question or a plea, but a statement. He almost refused. The work was hard, the cold brutal. She was slight, and the boy was just a child. They would be a liability. But he saw the look in her eyes, a fierce, unyielding pride. She would not be a charity case. They would not be sheltered pets. They would earn their keep. He gave a curt, reluctant nod. Stay close. Out in the snow, the cold was breathtaking. The sun on the fresh powder was blinding. The rancher set a hard pace, expecting them to fall behind. They did not. The woman wrapped the boy in layers of blankets and set him on a high, dry rock to watch, then took up the spare wire puller and set to work beside him. She was stronger than she looked, her movements efficient and learned. She watched him for a moment, then replicated his technique for tightening the wire, her smaller hands surprisingly deft. They worked for hours in a shared, focused silence. The only sounds, the creak of leather gloves, the groan of wood, and the metallic ping of the wire. He found himself observing her, this strange, resilient creature who had appeared in his barn. She never complained. She never faltered. When the boy grew cold, she took him in her arms and held him against her own body, sharing her warmth until he could return to his perch. Late in the afternoon, while clearing snow from a fallen post, his shovel struck a small wooden box he had buried there years ago, a memory chest. He pried it open. Inside, nestled in oilcloth, were a few precious, painful relics, a lock of his wife's blonde hair, her favorite thimble, and a small, crudely carved wooden horse. His son, Daniel, had made it for him the winter before he died. The rancher stared at it, the smooth, worn wood, cold against his glove. The pain was a sudden, sharp ambush. He was so lost in the moment, he didn't hear her approach. She did not ask, she did not pry. She simply looked from the toy in his hand to his face, and in her eyes he saw a deep, quiet understanding. It was the shared language of loss, a grief so profound it needed no translation. He closed the box, his movements stiff, and buried it again beneath the snow. They finished the fence line without another unspoken word passing between them. That evening, as they ate, he broke the silence. "Boy," he said, his voice rough, "what's his name?" "Taza," she replied softly. "It means little bear." "And you?" "My name is Nalin," she said. He nodded the name, feeling foreign on his tongue. Nalin. They were no longer shadows or trespassers. They were people. They had names. And as he looked at them across the small wooden table, in the flickering firelight of his solitary cabin, a dangerous and unwelcome thought took root in his mind. They were starting to belong. The thought terrified him. The thaw, when it came, was slow and grudging, turning the pristine snow to a landscape of gray slush and brown mud. The world was re-emerging, and with it came the necessity of other people. Supplies were low. A trip to town was unavoidable. The rancher felt a knot of apprehension tighten in his stomach. Town was a place of eyes and whispers, a place he endured, never enjoyed. To go there with Nalin and Taza felt like walking into a cage of wolves. He had no choice. He hitched the wagon, the silence between them heavy with unspoken anxiety. Nalin dressed Taza in the best she had, her hands smoothing his hair, a small, defiant act of dignity against the world's judgment. She herself wore the same dark, worn dress, but she held her head high, her back straight as a spear shaft. The town was just as he expected, As their wagon rolled down the main street, curtains twitched in windows. Men on the boardwalk stopped their conversations, their gazes lingering, filled with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. The whispers followed them like a foul wind. He saw the way Nalin flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of her shoulders, but her expression remained a mask of stoic indifference. Inside the general store, the air grew thick with hostile silence. People moved away from them, creating a small, empty circle around the rancher and his companions. He ignored them, his face set like stone as he began to tick items off his list. Flour, salt, coffee, cartridges. It was the preacher's wife who finally gave the town's prejudice a voice. She was a formidable woman, built of piety and iron, her face a permanent mask of sour disapproval. She cornered him by the barrel of nails, her smile as thin and sharp as a razor. "Well now," she began, her voice carrying through the silent store, a performance for the assembled audience. "I must say we were all so worried about you, all alone out there on that ranch since your tragedy. It does my heart good to see you found some companionship." She let her gaze slide over to Nalin, who was standing by the counter with Taza, her eyes fixed on a jar of striped candy. The woman's meaning was as clear as it was venomous. "Such a charitable man," she continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Taking in strays, though one must be so careful. You never know what sort of troubles they bring with them." The rancher felt a surge of cold fury. He hated this woman. He hated her smug certainty, her casual cruelty, the way she used her husband's God as a weapon. He saw Nalin's hand tighten on Taz's shoulder, pulling him closer. He saw the shame and fear in her eyes, and something inside him, something long dormant and fiercely protective, broke loose. He took a deliberate step forward, physically placing himself between the preacher's wife and Nalin. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The quiet intensity that radiated from him was more powerful than any shout. "They are with me," he said, his voice low and flat, each word a chip of ice. The preacher's wife recoiled, her face flushing with indignation. She had expected him to be cowed, embarrassed. She had not expected this quiet, unshakable wall of defiance. For a moment, the rancher turned his back on her, a final, brutal dismissal. He walked to the counter, paid for his goods, and then, in a move that stunned the entire store into silence, he reached for the jar of candy. He handed it to the storekeeper. "Add a bag of those to my bill." He took the small paper sack and walked over to Taza, kneeling down so he was at the boy's eye level. He held out the candy. The boy looked from the bag to his mother, his eyes wide with a mixture of desire and uncertainty. Nalin gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Taza shyly took the bag, his small fingers brushing against the rancher's calloused hand. Without another word, he led them out of the store, leaving a wake of stunned, resentful silence behind them. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but the quality of the silence had changed again. It was no longer just the absence of words. It was heavy with the unspoken things that had happened in the store. The attack, the defense, the small bag of candy that was more than just candy. The fragile piece of their isolation had been shattered. He had drawn a line in the sand, publicly declaring them under his protection. He knew, with a grim certainty, that the world would not let that stand. The warning shot had been fired that night. the cabin felt smaller, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to hold the tension of the day. The confrontation in town had changed something fundamental. He had not just offered them a roof, he had offered them his name, his shield. The weight of that decision settled on him. He sat staring into the flames. The wooden horse Taza had been carving, a clumsy imitation of the one he'd seen the rancher hold, lying on the table beside him. Nayland came down from the loft after Taza was asleep. She did not sit, but stood by the hearth, her silhouette framed by the fire. The silence stretched, filled with the crackling of the logs. He knew she was going to speak. He could feel the words gathering in the space between them. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. It was not just about the store. It was about everything. The barn, the food, the fence line. "Why did you not turn us out?" He did not look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the fire, on the memories that flickered there. He had asked himself the same question 100 times. The easy answer was the boy's eyes, the storm. It was the way their presence had begun to push back against the crushing weight of the silence. 5 years ago, he began, his voice raspy, a machine grinding back to life after years of rust. A son, Daniel. He was 6. He paused, the names feeling like stones in his mouth. There was a fever that winter. It came through the valley. It took them both within a week of each other. He finally turned to look at her. Her face was a study in compassion, her own grief a mirror to his. "I buried them, up on the ridge." After that, the quiet in this place, it wasn't peaceful, it was loud, a screaming in my ears. Every empty chair, every hook, with no coat on it. It was too much. Nothing. He picked up the small wooden horse from the table, his thumb tracing its rough edges. "When you and the boy came, it was a different kind of quiet. A quiet, with breath in it." He looked from the horse to her. "I helped you because your nothing looked a lot like mine. And I was tired of the sound my own was making." A log shifted in the fireplace, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Nayland watched them, her eyes reflecting the light. He had given her his truth, a piece of his brokenness. "My husband was a scout for the army," she said, her voice gaining a quiet strength. "His name was Chiricahua. He believed there could be peace. He tried to walk the path between two worlds. His own people saw him as a traitor. The soldiers saw him as a savage they could use. One day he did not come back. I was told he was killed by an Apache war band who thought he had betrayed them." She reached into a small pouch she wore around her neck and pulled out a small, intricately carved jade butterfly, one of its wings broken. "This was my mother's. After he was gone," she continued, "I was no longer welcome with my people. I had no place. I took Taza and I walked away. But there is a man, an agent from the reservation. He says my husband made a mark on a paper, a treaty. He says that because of this paper, my son belongs to the government, that he must be taken to a school in the East. A place to wash the Indian out of him." Her voice broke on the last words, a wave of pure terror and fury. "He has been hunting us. That is why we were in your barn. We were hiding. He is a man who collects people like property." The rancher felt the last of his detachment crumble. This was not a simple matter of prejudice or poverty. This was a specific predatory threat. The agent, the paper, the school. It was a cold, bureaucratic evil, far more dangerous than the open hostility of the preacher's wife. He looked at Nalin, at the broken butterfly in her palm, at the fierce, protective love in her eyes. He had offered them a roof against the storm. He now understood he would have to offer them a fortress against the world. The shift was complete. They were no longer strays he had taken in. They were his to defend. The spring that followed was a season of fragile peace, a time of quiet work and unspoken alliance. The rancher taught Taza how to track rabbits and how to tell the difference between good timber and bad. Nayland started a small garden behind the cabin, her hands coaxing green life from the stubborn soil. They worked as a unit, a silent, efficient team, their lives braiding together day by day. The fear of the agent from the reservation was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of their new routine, a shadow waiting at the edge of the woods. The shadow arrived on a bright, clear morning in late May. A polished black buggy, looking profoundly out of place against the rugged landscape, rolled up the path to the cabin. Two men sat in it. One was the town's lawman, a man the rancher knew to be fair, but unbendingly committed to the letter of the law. The other was a stranger, dressed in a fine city suit and a derby hat. He was well-fed, his face smooth and smug. He held a leather briefcase on his lap. It was the agent. The rancher met them on the porch, his stance relaxed, but his hands empty and visible. Nayland and Taza watched from the doorway behind him, Nayland's face pale but resolute. "Morning," the lawman said, his expression uncomfortable. "This is Mr. Thorne. He's an agent with the Bureau of Indian Affairs." Thorne stepped down from the buggy, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the soft dirt. He smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression that did not reach his eyes. "A pleasure," he said, though his tone made it clear it was not. "I am here on official business. I have papers here for the woman. They are wards of the United States government and are to be remanded into my custody for transport to the Carlisle Indian Industrial School." He opened his briefcase and produced a sheaf of documents bearing official-looking stamps and signatures. He held them out. The lawman took them, his brow furrowed as he read. "It seems to be in order," the lawman said, his voice heavy with reluctance. He looked at the rancher. "I'm sorry. The law is the law." "You can't just take them," the rancher said, his voice a low growl. Thorne's smile widened. "I assure you I can. It is my duty. These people are property of the state, a debt owed by her deceased husband. The paperwork is ironclad." He looked past the rancher to Nalin. "But the running is over," he turned back to the lawman. "I will grant them 3 days to prepare. I have business in the next county. I will return with a wagon on Friday at noon to collect the assets." He tipped his hat, a gesture of mocking courtesy, and climbed back into the buggy. As they drove away, the rancher saw another wagon cresting the hill, stopping to watch. In it sat the preacher's wife, her face a mask of vindicated triumph. She had brought the wolf to his door. The 3 days that followed were a descent into quiet desperation. The cabin became a war room. Thorne had left a copy of the warrant, and they pored over it by lantern light, late into the night. The rancher, a man of action, felt helpless, trapped by the unyielding authority of paper and ink. It was Nayland who found the first crack. Her English, learned from her husband, was better than she let on, and her mind was sharp. "Here," she said on the second night, her finger tracing a line of text. "It names my husband's army company, the 7th Cavalry, under Captain Benteen." She looked up at him. "But my husband was never with the 7th. He was a scout for General Crook. His captain was a man named Burt. It was a small thing, a detail, but it was wrong." Hope, thin and sharp, pierced the gloom. The rancher's mind raced. He had served under Crook himself, years ago, before he had met Sarah, before he had bought this land to escape the memories of that life. He had an old contact, a man who now worked as a clerk in the territorial capital's telegraph office, a man who owed him a life debt from a skirmish at the Rosebud. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. He left before dawn the next morning, riding his best horse into the ground to reach the town with the telegraph station 40 miles away. He sent a single, coded message, checking papers on Benteen Scout, Agent Thorne, urgent. He paid the operator double to ensure it was the first message sent, and that any reply would be dispatched by rider immediately. Then he rode back, the long journey filled with the agonizing torment of uncertainty. Friday arrived, a perfect, sun-drenched day that mocked the dread hanging over the ranch. At 11:30, 2 wagons appeared on the road. The first was the transport wagon driven by Thorne. In the second sat the lawman, and beside him the preacher's wife, who had come to witness her final victory. A small crowd of curious townsfolk trailed behind, eager for the drama. He was not holding a rifle. He was holding a simple axe handle, his knuckles white. Nallen and Taza stood behind him, not in the doorway this time, but at his side. They would face this together. Thorne strode up to the porch, his smugness radiating like heat. "The time is up. Let's not have any trouble." The lawman dismounted, his face grim. "I'm telling you for the last time," he said to the rancher. "It will only make it worse." The rancher didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the dusty road behind them, searching, praying. There was nothing but empty space. His gamble had failed. A profound, soul-crushing despair washed over him. "Get the boy," Thorne ordered, gesturing to one of his hired men. As the man started forward, the sound of hoofbeats, frantic and hard-driven, echoed from the distance. A single rider was galloping toward them, a lathered horse stretching its neck, dust pluming behind it. The rider was the telegraph operator's son. He didn't stop until he was at the porch, handing a yellow envelope to the lawman. "Came in an hour ago," the boy panted. "Urgent for you." The lawman tore it open. The silence was absolute, broken only by the heaving gasps of the horse. The lawman's eyes scanned the message, then scanned it again. His entire demeanor shifted. The reluctance fell away. Replaced by a cold, hard fury, he looked up, his eyes locking, not on the rancher, but on Agent Thorne. "This telegram is from the U.S. Marshal's office in the capital. It says that a man matching your description, using your name, is wanted for fraud, embezzlement, and the selling of fraudulent government contracts." He folded the paper slowly. "It says you were dishonorably discharged from the Bureau 6 months ago. It says these documents are forgeries, and it says there's a $500 bounty on your head." Thorne's face went white. The smug confidence evaporated, replaced by pure panic. "That's a lie, a trick," he stammered. "It also says," the lawman continued, his hand moving to the pistol at his hip, "that Nalan's husband, Kurikawa, was posthumously awarded a commendation for bravery, and that she and her son were granted full citizenship and a land pension 2 years ago. Paperwork was filed by a Captain John Bork." He took a step toward Thorne. "You're under arrest." Thorne made a desperate move, turning to run for his wagon. But the rancher's foreman and hands, who had been watching from the barn, loyalties now firmly declared, stepped out to block his path. Thorne was trapped. The preacher's wife stared, her mouth agape, her moment of triumph turning to one of utter public humiliation. The crowd of townsfolk began to murmur, their sympathies shifting with the dramatic tide of justice. The lawman cuffed the sputtering agent and led him away. As he passed the porch, he paused and looked at the rancher. He tipped his hat, a small, profound gesture of respect. "Looks like your paperwork was better than his," he said, a faint smile touching his lips. "You have a good day now." The wagons departed, taking the villain, the humbled social tyrant, and the gossiping crowd with them. They left behind a profound and victorious silence on the ranch. The rancher stood on the porch, the axe handle hanging loosely in his hand. Nalan moved to his side, her hand gently touching his arm. Taza came to his other side, leaning against his leg. The three of them stood there, watching the dust settle on the road. A small, unlikely fortress that had weathered the worst storm of all the spring that followed. It was vibrant, bursting with a life that seemed to mirror the transformation of the small cabin on the hill. The rancher, with the help of his foreman, added a new room to the house. The sound of hammers and saws, a cheerful, industrious rhythm that replaced the old, heavy silence. Nalan's garden expanded, a riot of green and color that supplied them with vegetables and herbs. The land, which had once been a refuge for one man's grief, was now a thriving homestead, a place of growth and purpose. The man himself was transformed. The hard lines around his eyes and mouth had softened. He still did not speak often, but his silences were different now. They were comfortable, shared. He smiled sometimes, a small, rare thing that appeared when Taza proudly showed him a perfectly carved bird, or when Nalan laughed at one of the foreman's bad jokes. The screaming quiet in his soul had been replaced by the soft, steady sounds of life. A woman humming by the hearth, a boy's eager questions, the simple, shared breath of a family. She was a partner, her quiet strength a bedrock for their shared world. She managed the accounts with a sharp mind, her input valued and sought. The town, having witnessed the public humiliation of the preacher's wife and the dramatic vindication of the rancher, had shifted its opinion. Respect had replaced suspicion. Nalan was no longer the Apache widow. She was the woman from the ranch, a figure of quiet dignity who had faced down a corrupt government man and won. One evening, as the last rays of a long summer sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, the three of them sat on the newly built porch. Taza was on the steps, carefully whittling a piece of wood, his brow furrowed in concentration. The rancher was in the rocking chair he had built for Nalan, its gentle creak a peaceful metronome for the evening. Nalan leaned against the porch rail, looking out at the land that was now their home. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly, "that day in the barn?" The rancher stopped rocking. He looked at her, then at the boy, then out at the rolling hills, and the creek that wound through the valley. He thought of the cold, empty man he had been, a ghost haunting the ruins of his own life. He thought of the rifle in his hands and the sentence that had lowered it. He thought of the noise of his unbearable solitude and the gentle living quiet that had replaced it. "A home is not the land you own," he said, his voice steady and clear, filled with a certainty he had not felt in years. "It is the people you choose to build the fence around." Nayland smiled, a true brilliant smile that lit up her face. She came and sat on the arm of his chair, her hand resting on his shoulder. Taza looked up from his work, holding up his newest creation, a small, perfect wooden butterfly, its wings whole and unbroken. The rancher reached out and took it, its smooth, hopeful shape resting in the palm of his hand. Together the three of them watched the last of the light fade, a complete and solid family.